They say some places wait for the right person to arrive, and some promises take a lifetime to find their way home. On the coldest night of that winter, Ethan Walker wasn't looking for a miracle. He was simply trying to make it through another storm. The snow fell thick across the Black Pine Mountains, covering the winding road in a blanket of white that seemed to swallow the world mile after mile. His aging pickup groaned against the climb, headlights cutting narrow tunnels through the darkness while the wind rattled the windows like restless fingers. Beside him sat Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd whose silver-gray coat caught the faint dashboard light. The dog had been unusually alert for the last hour, ears forward, amber eyes fixed on something beyond the windshield. Ethan noticed it, but said nothing. At 40 years old, he had learned that Ranger often sensed things long before he did. The fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty. The nearest town was more than 20 miles away. Then, through the storm, a single golden light appeared high on the mountainside. It glowed alone against the darkness, warm and steady, like a lantern refusing to surrender to the night. Ranger immediately sat upright and let out a quiet breath. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Something about that distant light felt less like a destination and more like an invitation. The narrow road curved around a ridge and climbed higher into the mountains. Snow drifted across the hood of the truck in ghostly waves, glowing pale beneath the headlights. As Ethan followed the distant light, the forest slowly opened around him. Towering pines stood silent beneath layers of fresh snow, their branches bending under the weight of winter. The deeper he drove, the stranger the silence became. There were no other vehicles, no cabins, no signs of life. Only the storm and that single golden light waiting somewhere ahead. Ranger remained unusually focused. His ears never relaxed. His gaze stayed fixed on the darkness beyond the windshield, as if he could already see what lay at the end of the road. Then, just as the fuel warning light flickered again, the mountain inn appeared. Ethan eased off the gas and stared through the falling snow. The building stood 3 stories tall against the mountainside, built from weathered stone and dark timber. Warm yellow light glowed from several windows. Smoke drifted lazily from a chimney into the night sky. It looked less like a business and more like something preserved from another century. A place forgotten by time. The wooden sign near the entrance creaked softly in the wind. Holloway Mountain Inn. Ethan parked beneath a lantern hanging from an iron hook. The engine died with a tired shudder. For a moment he simply sat there, listening. The storm seemed quieter now, almost distant. Ranger was already staring at the front door. Not impatient, not anxious. Watching, waiting. Ethan pulled his coat tighter and stepped into the cold. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he approached the entrance. The old wooden porch groaned beneath his weight. Before he could knock, the door opened. Warm light spilled across the snow. A woman stood in the doorway. She appeared to be in her late 70s, wrapped in a dark green wool sweater with silver hair gathered neatly behind her head. Her face carried the gentle lines of a life fully lived, and her pale blue eyes seemed brighter than the lantern above her. For several seconds, she simply looked at Ethan. Not surprised, not alarmed, almost as though she had been expecting him. "You must be freezing," she said softly. Her voice carried the calm warmth of a fireplace on a winter evening. "Come inside." Ethan hesitated. Something about the moment felt oddly familiar, though he knew he had never been here before. Ranger climbed the steps beside him. The instant the dog reached the doorway, the woman's expression changed. A faint smile appeared. "Well now," she whispered. "There you are." Ethan glanced down at Ranger. The shepherd had stopped moving. His tail swayed once, then twice. He stepped forward and sat directly beside the woman. She lowered a hand and gently touched the side of his neck. Ranger closed his eyes. Ethan had seen his dog around hundreds of strangers over the years. Ranger was friendly, but cautious. He never trusted anyone immediately. Yet now he looked completely at ease, as though greeting someone he had known for years. The woman smiled again, though her eyes seemed distant for a moment. "You both took longer to arrive than I expected," she said quietly. Ethan frowned. "Have we met before?" The woman looked toward the storm beyond the doorway. Snow continued falling across the empty mountainside. Then she stepped aside. "No," she replied. "But sometimes the mountain knows who is coming long before we do." The warmth inside the inn felt almost unreal after the cold outside. A stone fireplace crackled softly in the main lounge. casting golden light across polished wooden floors worn smooth by generations of footsteps. The scent of cedar, old books, and fresh coffee lingered in the air. Ethan removed his gloves and stood quietly for a moment, taking it all in. There was something comforting about the place, yet beneath that comfort lay a strange feeling he could not explain. It was as though the inn carried memories inside its walls. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Holloway and led him toward a small dining room overlooking the snow-covered valley. Through the tall windows, the mountains stretched endlessly beneath the moonlit sky. She poured coffee into a thick ceramic mug and placed it before him. Steam curled upward like pale ribbons. Ranger settled near the fireplace, but remained alert. Every few moments his ears twitched toward the ceiling. Margaret noticed immediately. "He hears it too," she said quietly. Ethan looked up. "Here's what?" Margaret smiled faintly, but did not answer. Instead, she gazed toward the upper floors. The silence that followed seemed unusually heavy. Ethan eventually changed the subject. They spoke about the weather, the mountains, and the long roads that crossed the region. Margaret's voice carried an easy warmth, yet there were moments when her attention drifted elsewhere, as if she were listening to something distant. As the evening passed, Ethan learned that she had operated the inn for nearly 40 years. Travelers once filled every room. Families returned generation after generation. But over time, new highways diverted traffic away from the mountain roads. Visitors became fewer. Businesses closed. People moved away. Yet Margaret stayed. "Some places are worth waiting for," she said while staring into the fire. The words lingered in Ethan's mind. Later that night, after finishing a simple meal, Margaret showed him to a guest room on the second floor. The hallway was lined with framed photographs stretching back decades. Old black and white images showed smiling families, mountain guides, newlyweds, and travelers standing proudly in front of the inn. Ethan paused beside one photograph. A young couple stood on the porch sometime during the 1950s. Behind them, a German shepherd sat at attention. Something about the image felt oddly familiar. Before he could study it further, Ranger suddenly stopped walking. The dog stared upward toward the ceiling. Completely still, Ethan followed his gaze. Above them sat the third floor, a section of the inn that appeared darker than the rest. Closed, quiet, yet not entirely silent. At first Ethan thought it was the wind. Then he heard it. A faint scraping sound. Slow, deliberate, like a chair gently moving across a wooden floor. Ranger's ears shot forward. Another sound followed. Soft footsteps. 3 distinct creaks overhead. Then silence. Ethan glanced toward Margaret. She stood at the end of the hallway holding a lantern. Her expression had changed. Not frightened. Not surprised. Simply thoughtful. "Is someone staying upstairs?" Ethan asked. Margaret remained silent for several seconds. The lantern light flickered across her face. Finally, she shook her head. "No one has stayed on the third floor for over 30 years. Ethan frowned. Ranger continued staring upward. His amber eyes never blinked. Then, for the first time since arriving, the dog released a low whine deep in his throat. Not fear. Not warning. Recognition. Margaret slowly looked toward the ceiling. "That usually happens when the mountain decides it is time," she whispered. Before Ethan could ask what she meant, the old grandfather clock downstairs struck 9. Somewhere above them, a door gently clicked shut. Sleep did not come easily that night. Long after the hallway fell silent and the last embers in, the fireplace faded into a soft orange glow. Ethan lay awake staring at the ceiling of his room. Outside, the storm continued drifting across the mountains. Wind brushed gently against the windows, carrying faint whispers through the pine trees. Normally, such sounds would have helped him rest. Years of sleeping in trucks, shelters, and lonely campsites had taught him how to find peace in quiet places. But something about this inn felt different. It was not unsettling. It was watchful, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Ranger lay near the foot of the bed. For nearly an hour the dog remained still. Then suddenly his head lifted. His ears turned toward the door. Ethan immediately noticed the change. Ranger did not bark. He simply stood and walked into the center of the room. His eyes focused on something beyond the wall. A few seconds later came the sound. Very faint, almost too soft to hear. Footsteps. Slow and measured. Somewhere above them. Ethan sat upright. The sound crossed the ceiling overhead and disappeared. Then came another noise. A gentle scrape of wood against wood. The same sound he had heard earlier in the hallway. Ranger moved closer to the door. His tail remained relaxed, but his attention never wavered. Ethan slipped on his boots and opened the door. The hallway beyond was empty. Moonlight spilled through a tall window at the far end, painting silver patterns across the floorboards. The old photographs lining the walls seemed strangely alive beneath the shifting shadows. Ranger stepped into the hallway and immediately turned toward the staircase leading upward. The third floor. Ethan followed. The stairs creaked softly beneath their weight. Each step carried them farther from the warmth below and deeper into the quiet heart of the inn. The air felt cooler here, older somehow. At the top of the staircase, a long corridor stretched into darkness. Several doors lined either side. Dust rested undisturbed across the floor. Yet one detail immediately caught Ethan's attention. Near the far end of the hallway stood a single door. Unlike the others, its brass handle shone brightly, polished as though someone had touched it recently. Ranger walked directly toward it. His pace was steady, certain. When he reached the door, he sat and looked back at Ethan, waiting. Ethan approached slowly. Above the frame hung a small wooden plaque. Room 307. The number had faded with age. He reached for the handle. Before his hand touched the brass, a voice drifted quietly from behind him. I wondered how long it would take. Ethan turned sharply. Margaret stood at the top of the stairs holding a lantern. The warm light illuminated the silver strands of her hair and the calm expression on her face. She did not appear surprised to find them there. In fact, she almost looked relieved. Ethan glanced back at the door. What is this room? He asked. Margaret's eyes lingered on room 307. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she slowly stepped forward. It belonged to my husband, she said softly. No one has entered it in 30 years. The lantern flame flickered as a distant gust brushed the windows somewhere below. Ranger remained seated beside the door. His gaze never moved. Margaret looked down at him and smiled sadly. The last shepherd who stayed here used to do exactly the same thing. Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Then Margaret reached into her sweater pocket and withdrew an old iron key worn smooth by time. She placed it gently into Ethan's hand. Perhaps, she whispered, the room has finally decided it is ready to be opened. The old key felt surprisingly heavy in Ethan's palm. Decades of use had worn the iron smooth, and yet it seemed to carry more than age. It carried history. For a long moment nobody moved. The lantern glowed softly between them, while snow tapped gently against a distant window. Ranger remained seated beside the door, patient and focused, as though he already knew what waited beyond it. Margaret finally stepped closer. The light caught the moisture gathering in her eyes. His name was Samuel Holloway, she said quietly. My husband. Her voice drifted through the corridor like a memory returning home. Ethan listened without speaking. He had learned long ago that some stories revealed themselves only when given silence. Margaret rested her hand against the doorframe. Samuel built this in with his father. Every beam, every stone, every floorboard. Back then travelers crossed these mountains every season. Hunters, fishermen, newly married couples, families searching for a place to breathe. A faint smile touched her face. He believed every traveler carried a story worth hearing. The lantern flickered softly. Ranger lowered his head, but remained beside the door. Margaret's eyes followed him. We never had children. Life simply moved in a different direction. So this became our family. Ethan glanced down the long hallway. The photographs. The guest rooms. The worn wood polished by countless footsteps. Suddenly the place felt less like a business and more like a living collection of lives connected across generations. What happened? Ethan asked gently. Margaret took a slow breath. One winter, a storm much like this one arrived. She looked toward the dark windows at the end of the corridor. Samuel went out to help stranded travelers lower on the mountain. That was who he was. If someone needed help, he went. Her smile returned briefly. He never learned how to walk away from people. The silence that followed carried no bitterness, only longing. After he was gone, I could not bring myself to close the inn. So I stayed. Year after year. I kept the rooms ready. I kept the lights burning. Her gaze drifted upward, as if listening to something beyond the ceiling. And I waited. Ethan frowned slightly. For who? Margaret looked directly at him. The question seemed to hang in the air between them. Yet before she answered, Ranger suddenly stood. His ears lifted. His tail gave a slow sweep. Then he walked to the wall opposite room 307 and stopped beside an old framed photograph. Ethan followed him. The photograph showed a group of men standing outside the inn nearly 40 years earlier. Most wore work jackets and mountain gear. One man stood near the center beside Samuel Holloway. Ethan's breath caught. He stepped closer. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The same strong jaw. The same gray eyes. The same expression. "That is impossible," Ethan whispered. Margaret approached slowly. "No," she replied. "I do not think it is." Ethan stared at the photograph. The man beside Samuel looked remarkably like his late father. Younger, of course, but unmistakable. Memories surfaced unexpectedly. Old stories told around kitchen tables. Mentions of a mountain friend. A place his father once spoke about, but never fully explained. Margaret nodded softly. "Your father stayed here many years ago." The words settled over the corridor like falling snow. And before he left, he made a promise to Samuel. Ranger sat once more beside room 307. Waiting. Listening. As though he understood that the story Ethan had spent years unknowingly searching for was finally beginning to unfold. Margaret slowly reached for the key in Ethan's hand and closed his fingers around it. "Your father came here during the winter of 1987, she said softly. "He stayed only 3 nights, but Samuel spoke about him for the rest of his life." The lantern cast long shadows across the corridor as snow drifted against the distant windows. Ethan could barely take his eyes off the photograph. Memories of his father had always come in fragments. Stories left unfinished. Conversations interrupted by time. Yet now those missing pieces seemed to be waiting somewhere inside this mountain inn. Ranger rose and pressed his nose gently against the door of room 307. The brass handle reflected the lantern light like a small golden flame. Margaret nodded toward it. "Go ahead." Ethan hesitated only a moment before sliding the old iron key into the lock. The mechanism resisted at first. Then a deep metallic click echoed through the hallway. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, almost ceremonial. Slowly, he pushed the door open. Cool air drifted from inside. The room beyond appeared untouched by time. Moonlight spilled through lace curtains onto polished wooden floors. A stone fireplace rested along one wall. A writing desk stood near the window. Books lined narrow shelves. Everything remained exactly where someone had left it decades earlier. Not abandoned. Preserved. Ethan stepped inside. Ranger followed immediately. The shepherd moved through the room with quiet purpose, sniffing corners and studying objects as though searching for something familiar. Margaret remained in the doorway. Her eyes reflected both sadness and peace. Ethan approached the desk. Resting upon its surface sat an old leather journal covered in dust. Beside it lay a folded map of the valley and a small framed photograph showing Samuel Holloway standing beside Ethan's father near a mountain trail. Both men were smiling. The sight tightened something deep inside Ethan's chest. He had not seen his father's smile in years. Ranger suddenly stopped near the far wall. His ears lifted. Then he scratched gently against a section of wood paneling beside the bookshelf. Once. Twice. Ethan looked over. The dog rarely acted without reason. He crossed the room and examined the wall. At first nothing appeared unusual. Then he noticed a small brass latch nearly hidden within the grain of the wood. Carefully he pressed it. A narrow panel swung open. Behind it rested a hidden compartment. Inside sat a sealed envelope yellowed with age. Written across the front in neat handwriting were 6 simple words. "For the son of Daniel Walker." Ethan froze. The room seemed to fall completely silent. Even the wind outside appeared to stop. Margaret covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Tears gathered in her eyes. "Samuel always believed the day would come," she whispered. Ethan stared at the envelope. His father's name. His own family. His own history. Somehow all of it had been waiting here on a forgotten mountainside. Ranger sat quietly beside him, watching with calm amber eyes. As Ethan carefully lifted the envelope from the compartment, something slipped from behind it and landed softly on the floor. It was another key, smaller than the first, older, attached to a tarnished metal tag marked with a single word, Valley. For several seconds Ethan could do nothing except stare at the envelope and the small key resting in his hands. The room seemed suspended outside of time. Snow drifted past the windows in slow white spirals while moonlight washed across the floorboards. Ranger remained beside him, calm and watchful, as though this discovery was not a surprise but the next step in a path he had sensed from the very beginning. Carefully, Ethan broke the brittle seal. Inside rested a folded letter written in fading blue ink. The handwriting belonged to Samuel Holloway. Ethan unfolded the pages and began to read. If you are holding this letter, then life has completed a journey neither your father nor I lived long enough to see. The words immediately tightened his throat. He continued reading. Samuel described the winter when Daniel Walker had arrived at the inn decades earlier. Stranded by a storm, carrying little more than a backpack and a determination that reminded Samuel of himself. During those few days, the two men became close friends. They worked together, shared meals, repaired fences, and spoke late into the night about family, purpose, and the future. According to the letter, Daniel had dreamed of one day returning to the mountains and building a place where weary people could find rest. But life carried him elsewhere. Responsibilities grew. Years passed. The return trip never happened. Ethan lowered the page for a moment. The story sounded painfully familiar. Too many good intentions lost beneath the weight of time. Ranger nudged his hand gently. Ethan continued reading. Near the end of the letter, Samuel revealed something unexpected. Several years before his passing, he and Daniel had purchased a large section of valley land together. Not for profit, not for development. They intended to preserve it, to protect it from being sold away piece by piece. Samuel wrote that the land remained untouched for decades under a private trust known only to a handful of people. Attached to the trust was a single condition. Ownership would eventually pass to the first direct descendant of Daniel Walker, who arrived at the inn and chose kindness over ambition. Ethan blinked several times. The words hardly seemed real. Margaret sat quietly near the doorway, listening as tears rolled down her cheeks. She had clearly heard portions of the letter before, yet the emotions remained fresh. Ethan reached the final paragraph. The valley key belongs to the caretaker who arrives not seeking ownership, but belonging. If that person is you, then the mountains have finally kept their promise. Silence settled over the room, deep and complete. Ethan stared at the small metal tag attached to the key. Valley. Suddenly dozens of small details began fitting together. Margaret waiting all these years. The room remaining untouched. The strange sense of familiarity from the moment he arrived. Then another realization surfaced. He looked toward Margaret. You knew? She smiled softly. Not everything. Only that Samuel believed someone would come one day. Ethan glanced around the room. The photographs. The journal. The preserved memories. All of it waiting through decades of changing seasons. Before he could speak again, Ranger suddenly stood and walked toward the window. His ears lifted sharply. Far below, beyond the snow-covered slopes, faint lights shimmered across the valley floor. Margaret followed his gaze. Her expression changed. For the first time that evening, genuine surprise appeared in her eyes. That cannot be, she whispered. Ethan stepped closer to the glass. Hidden beneath the snowfall, a road of lanterns stretched across the valley like a glowing ribbon, leading toward a place that had not appeared on any map he had ever seen. By dawn the storm had begun to fade. Pale sunlight spilled across the mountains, turning the snow into a sea of silver and gold. Ethan barely slept. The image of those distant lanterns remained fixed in his mind. After a simple breakfast, he, Margaret, and Ranger followed an old trail that descended into the valley. The small key rested safely inside Ethan's coat pocket. As they moved lower along the mountainside, the mysterious lights slowly disappeared beneath the morning sun, yet the path remained. Stone markers emerged from the snow at regular intervals, each carved with the same symbol etched into the valley key. Margaret stared at them in disbelief. I have lived here nearly 40 years, she said softly. I never knew this road existed. Ranger led the way. His pace never slowed. Every few minutes he would stop, glance back toward Ethan, then continue forward as though following instructions only he could hear. Nearly 2 miles from the inn, the trail opened into a wide clearing hidden between towering ridges. Ethan stopped. Before them stood an old stone gate partially covered by vines and snow. Beyond it stretched a beautiful valley untouched by modern development. Wooden cabins stood among groves of pine trees. A crystal-clear stream wound through the center like a ribbon of glass. Small bridges crossed the water. Gardens slept beneath winter frost. It looked less like property and more like a forgotten sanctuary. Near the entrance stood a weathered sign. Ethan brushed away the snow covering its surface. The words underneath made his heart skip. Walker Hollow Preserve. His father's name. His family name. Margaret covered her mouth in shock. Ranger sat quietly beside the sign. Ethan slowly approached the gate. The small key fit perfectly into an iron lock hidden beneath the stone arch. As the mechanism clicked open, another discovery waited inside. Mounted on the wall beyond the gate was a metal box protected from the weather. Within it rested legal documents, property records, and a sealed envelope addressed jointly to Margaret Holloway and the Walker family. Together they opened it. The documents revealed the truth Samuel had protected for decades. The preserve, the cabins, the surrounding valley, and the mountain in itself had all been placed into a private trust years earlier. Samuel had never intended the property to become a commercial resort or be sold to developers. He wanted it preserved as a refuge for travelers, veterans, and families seeking peace. At the bottom of the final page sat the signature of a law firm in Denver and instructions for immediate transfer of ownership. Ethan stared silently at the paperwork. The inheritance was real. Not just the valley. Not just the preserve. Everything. Yet what affected him most was the final handwritten note attached beneath the documents. It was written by Samuel. Wealth is not what I leave behind. A place is not what I leave behind. I leave behind a promise. If you are reading this, then the promise survived. Ethan looked across the valley. Sunlight touched the frozen stream. Smoke rose from an old chimney someone had apparently maintained long after Samuel's passing. For the first time in many years, he no longer felt like a man drifting through the world. He felt as though he had finally arrived somewhere he was meant to be. Spring arrived slowly in the mountains. Snow retreated from the valleys, streams awakened beneath the warming sun, and the long silence of winter gave way to birdsong drifting through the pines. Months had passed since the night Ethan first followed a distant light through the storm. The mountain no longer stood waiting in loneliness. Fresh paint brightened the porch railings. Warm lanterns glowed in the windows each evening. Travelers had begun returning once again, drawn not by advertisements or highway signs, but by stories shared from one person to another. Stories about a peaceful place hidden among the mountains where strangers were welcomed like family. Margaret remained in her small room overlooking the valley, her health fragile, but her spirit stronger than ever. She often sat beside the window with a blanket across her lap, watching life return to the property Samuel had loved. More than once Ethan caught her smiling toward the mountains for no visible reason. He suspected she was speaking silently to old memories. Ranger became something of a legend among visitors. Children followed him along the trails. Hikers greeted him by name. Yet every evening, without fail, he climbed the hill overlooking Walker Hollow Preserve and sat facing the western ridge as the sun disappeared beyond the peaks. Ethan usually joined him. On one such evening, golden light spilled across the valley floor while the stream below reflected the sky like liquid fire. Cabins stood ready for guests. Gardens bloomed near the footpaths. Laughter drifted upward from families sharing meals beneath the trees. Ethan sat on a weathered bench Samuel had once built decades earlier. In his hands rested the final letter from the hidden compartment. He had read it many times, yet certain lines still felt new each time he opened it. Not because the words changed, but because he did. Ranger settled beside him and rested his head against Ethan's knee. The familiar gesture brought an unexpected smile. For years they had wandered from place to place, with no destination beyond tomorrow. They had survived difficult seasons, lonely roads, and countless nights beneath unfamiliar skies. Yet looking across the valley now, Ethan realized something profound. The greatest gift Samuel left behind was never the land, the cabins, or the inn. It was belonging. It was purpose. It was the quiet certainty that some journeys end exactly where they are supposed to. As the last sunlight touched the mountains, a gentle breeze moved through the pines. Somewhere below, the inn's bell rang softly. One clear note carried across the valley. Then another. Ethan looked toward the sound. Warm lights glowed from every window. People gathered inside. Conversations, laughter, and life filled the old building once more. Ranger lifted his ears, listening. Then, satisfied, he closed his eyes. Ethan folded the letter and slipped it carefully into his jacket pocket. The mountains stretched endlessly before him, peaceful and unchanged. Yet everything had changed. For the first time in many years, he was not searching for a place to go. He was home.